Good afternoon, everybody. So I count 20 people. We had 40 people signed up. So I wish I can give you extra credit somehow. Maybe we can figure that out. But anyway, I'm Matt Tucker, so I helped organize this training. I'm with the Orange County Stormwater Program, if you've never met me before. Two things, just to, before we get started, if you need some sort of certificate of completion, you can call or email me, and I can provide a certificate of completion, just showing you that you came to this training. And number two, our presenter today is Karen Ashby, and we're glad she's here. We're glad she is here for the main reason that she does have municipal experience. So what she is presenting today, she does have experience in that. It was from a ways back, but some things you'll never forget, will you? Especially spill response.
Exactly.
There's things that you just cannot get off your mind. So if there's any, well, I think we're here for 3 hours. And do we get one break?
Yes, I think we'll kind of gauge time.
Okay.
But yeah, I think we'll build in a 5-10 minute break.
Okay. So thank you for coming, and we will get started. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So I have a couple. Normally I'd be here earlier. The 5 was like dead still for what seemed like an eternity. But I have 2 things that I'd like to hand out. One of which I'd like for you to take 5 or so minutes and fill out. Yeah, if you hand out one, I can hand out the other one. In fact, I'll just hand these back. Yeah, you want to? Yeah, that'd be fantastic. One is a handout. One is a handout that we're going to be referring to for today, and the other is a pre-survey, which it's anonymous. Just fill out to the best of your ability, and then we're going to do it again at the end, just to kind of gauge how well we did on conveying key messages we wanted to have you leave with. So you can so Matt's handing those out. Yeah, perfect. And then the other handout's making its way around. So we'll handing those out, and I would say we will. Whoops, did he get those? Not on this side, huh? Looks like he just ducked out. He'll be back. So I'll say by like 12 after. Yeah, Matt, those will go on both sides. Oh, perfect. You're grabbing a pen. Awesome. So I'd say by like maybe 12 after or so. Let's take 5 to 7 minutes to fill these out, and then maybe Matt, if you could help me gather those in the end. And then again, we'll revisit that at the very end of the training. But I will tell you that we will have you out of here by 4. I'm sure you all have busy lives and things you need to get to, and I also have to be leaving by 4, so we will make sure that happens. Oh, the presentation. Yeah.
I have about 5 extra printouts. Anybody needs a, you want it?
Yeah, and if you didn't bring a handout of the presentation and you would like one, we can always make sure, I can work with Matt and Duke to make sure you get one. Yeah.
In order to record properly, can you stand closer?
Staying closer to the mic, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Good reminder. Okay, so when you're done with the pre-survey, if you can just raise your hand up real quick, and then Matt can help gather those up.
Do you need a mouse, or is the touchpad okay?
I think this is perfect.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, this thing is just transmitting.
Yeah, is it okay how
Yeah.
this is? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I'll let you know if anything happens.
I would greatly appreciate that. Yeah, I'm sorry. question where one of the answers refers to itself, my apologies, that's a typo. If you need to, just don't worry about that question if it doesn't make sense. Nobody brought that up this morning, so it makes me wonder. I have a handout if you guys. Oh, yes. Oh, it maybe it didn't make its way over. Yeah. You just need to, or does it need to go back? For those of you who just came in, they're working on a pre-survey. Because of timing, I'm going to go ahead and just let you guys hang. It will be done in about 2 minutes. Yeah. So yeah, you're not missing any. Yeah, I know. Yeah, we'll finish those in about a minute or two. I will mention that, yeah. Yes, and you did, yeah. But I'll mention it again. I have a handout. Seems like you have one. Okay, there you go. You're welcome. Okay, well, I think for those of you who are still working on your survey, please go ahead and complete that. I'll just give some introductory remarks, and then when you're done, if you can just kind of wave Matt down, and then he can help collect them. So as Matt mentioned, this session is being recorded, so just be aware of that for full disclosure. But what is really important, one of the things that I'd like to do is, even though I'm walking through some material, to the extent that there's dialogue back and forth, I think it's pretty useful. If you have something to add to something I'm saying, or you have a question, this is really, you don't have to wait for that moment. I do have pauses where I will ask for questions, so you can think about them. But if something pops in your head, just informally raise your hand. It's completely fine. And in fact, I would actually prefer it because it breaks it up a little bit and I think makes it more interactive. The other thing is that Matt and Duke and other county staff are here because they're, working as authorized inspectors. They have tons of experience, and so they're going to also help kind of ground truth some of what I'm saying. They can also help answer very specific questions that you might have. So raise those questions up, because whatever answers are provided will help other people to understand some of the information. And so just by way of quick background, for those that are in the room, how many of you have been functioning as an authorized inspector, or even have familiarity with the stormwater program for like 1 year or less? just so I can kind of gauge what people know in the room. Like 1 year or less, okay. How about like 1 to 5 years? Okay, perfect. And what about over 5 years? Perfect, okay, good. So we have a really good mix, and I think that that's important because, again, as questions are raised, I don't have all the answers, and there's a ton of knowledge that's in this room, so I really welcome other people to jump in and help answer those, and I'll even defer if I'm not really sure what the answer is to have you help answer the questions. So I really think it's good for you all to help with that, given especially your breadth of knowledge. So brief introduction, Karen Ashby with Larry Walker Associates. I worked with Orange County Stormwater Program from 1990 to about 2003. And I started from field sampling in Newport Bay and did, function as an authorized inspector, worked really closely with Duke for a period of time, Matt as well, and then left in 2003, still the whole time with the Stormwater Program and with Orange County. So hopefully I bring still some of that knowledge and experience and kind of the methods and tools that we used back then. But what I do recognize is that over time, the program evolves and the tools are refined and they respond and evolve based on the permit requirements. And so that's where some of the nuances and questions that you all may have would be really good to ask. And that's where county staff and, again, some others may be able to help answer some of those. Okay, so I think that's all I have. I think you have instructions about where the restrooms are, so we'll go ahead and get started. And for those who just came in, there are some handouts that there's actually one handout that I'll put up here if you want to come grab them. Additional one. One more up here. Yeah, and if you didn't get a copy of the handout of the presentation and you're interested in one, let us know afterwards and we can make sure we get you that. Okay. So for today, what we're going to be going through, this is the outline. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the training program framework. And this is a framework and kind of a training program that's been designed specifically for, do you need one more? Yeah. There you go, thanks. It's been designed specifically for the Stormwater Program. So we're going to talk about that framework and where IDIC and authorized inspectors fit into that. Also talk about the objectives of the training program, what we want, what is it we're trying to achieve with you all spending time here today. A brief Stormwater Program overview. And this is, pretty 101 type of information, but for those folks who are newer to the Stormwater Program, I think it's good to make sure that we're all kind of starting on the same foundation about what the Stormwater Program requires and how the Stormwater Program and then all the different documents kind of relate to each other. So we'll give a little bit of foundation and definitions regarding the Stormwater Program. If you know all this, just take a breather and kind of go through it, and then we'll move on to some of the other pieces. We'll talk also about the Water Quality Ordinance in particular, and as well as other guidance tools and documents that are available to you. That's one thing that I really want you to leave with, is understanding that there are tools and documents that are out there that, to the extent that they're helpful to you and you want to reach out and have them, they're available. So we'll point those out. And then we're going to shift a little bit and talk about methods of detection, the response framework, and then investigations in particular, things that you can think about when you're responding to an incident and conducting an investigation. And we'll talk a little bit both about kind of small and larger types of incidents and how the tools that we'll talk through can be scaled up or down depending on how you need to use them and depending upon their applicability. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about resources available to you, although this will be sprinkled throughout, but in particular, the inspection subcommittee and some of the specific trainings that have gone on through that committee. And I think that that's really important because, again, the purpose of today's module is really to provide a very foundational overview of the Stormwater Program, IDIC Program in particular, and authorized inspector duties, kind of roles and responsibilities. But many of the topics I'm going to touch on could be their own modules. And so I would encourage you, where you want additional information, really seek some of those out, because there are a lot of opportunities for you to dive much deeper into a lot of these different topics. Okay, so with that, we'll start down our list. So the training program framework, this document was initially developed in about 2008 or 2009, and it was developed because of pretty much two reasons. One is because the permit requirements started to require more training and have like kind of a higher expectation about what staff need to know, especially during audits. And there was also a desire in the reported waste discharge, which is a very large assessment of the stormwater program that the cities and county conduct about every 5 years. So there was kind of an identified internal need as well as an external requirement, more and more focused on training. So the county, in conjunction with the cities, worked on this training program framework. And the thing that I really like about this, and I've seen this kind of popping up more and more throughout the state, is that it really formalizes in a very proactive way understanding what do we need to be trained on, what skills should staff have, and what is the appropriate frequency for that type of training to happen. Because a lot of times you'll see municipalities, and again, I'm talking more in other areas of the state, but you'll see municipalities kind of responding and reacting to training needs instead of really proactively planning for and making sure that staff are appropriately trained or adequately trained so they feel comfortable in doing their jobs, and also so that they're effective at their jobs. So this was developed for that purpose. It's one of the few in the state that I've seen. It's the most comprehensive, but I think it's not overly comprehensive. I think it touches on really the core components that it needs to. And in particular, and my next slide will show this, it focuses on 7 key areas of responsibility within the stormwater program, authorized inspectors being one of those 7. And what it does, it breaks down, and we'll touch on this a little bit further, it talks about what the core competencies are for each of these areas of responsibility. So it'll identify what are the knowledge, skills, and experiences that that person in that role should have or is encouraged to have, again, in order to be effective at their portion of the stormwater program. And we'll talk specifically about the handout that I provided you, which is that very section for authorized inspectors. Okay, so like I mentioned, the training program focuses on, actually, let me look where I touch on that. Perfect. The training program framework touches on 7 key areas of responsibility, which I mentioned. And one of those, again, is the authorized inspectors, which you can see is highlighted in one of those circles. But if you're curious, the other areas that it talks about are listed there in the circles around it. So program managers, post-construction inspectors, planners, plan checkers, et cetera. And the handout that we will get to in a couple of slides is that section of the training program framework for authorized inspectors. It's draft because we're currently updating it, but it provides a really good foundation, at least for now, and then you can get the final version when it is finalized. And so when we're talking about, there's a lot of terms that I'll kind of take a moment to define as we go through different portions of this module. But one of them is, well, what is an authorized inspector specifically? How is it defined? And there are probably others, but there are 2 key definitions that I've come across that are included here on the slide. And they're really pretty much the same. They're saying roughly the same things. I think the difference between the definition in the Water Quality Ordinance compared to the Enforcement Consistency Guide is really dealing with kind of at what point is an authorized inspector kind of responding versus actually, sorry, I guess it's the levels of responsibility between the authorized inspectors and spill responders. So a spill responder might have a little bit more knowledge and experience in responding to incidents and working on cleaning up and enforcement and stuff than an authorized inspector may have, according to the Enforcement Consistency Guide. But in general, an authorized inspector can do both of those job functions, and the definition in the ordinance, I think, is broad enough that says assigned to investigate compliance with, detect violations of, and or take actions pursuant to the ordinance. So that's really kind of roughly the role and responsibility of the authorized inspector. Okay. And some of the training opportunities, which we'll come back to a little bit more in the end, and that Matt certainly makes people aware of through the inspection subcommittee, include things like HAZWOPER training and other types of external training, such as what's provided by Western States Project. And so again, to the extent that you're interested in additional training, we'll highlight some of those additional experiences or opportunities at the very end. Okay, so for authorized inspectors, thinking back again to the training program framework, the handout that I provided is basically that section of the framework for authorized inspectors. And there are, again, 6 others that are just like this that outline the same types of roles and responsibilities for the other key functions. So you can see it's a pretty short section. It doesn't take a lot to get through it. And so there's some brief discussion on the first page about, again, kind of defining what an authorized inspector is. And then more importantly, and where I would spend your time to the extent that it interests you, is this table. And so what we've done on the table that's the 11 by 17 sheet and is outlined on the slide that's showing right now is that there are 3 key areas that this touches on. The first is core competencies, and that's the far left column. And what this is saying is, as an authorized inspector, you should be able to, and then it lists a number of types of things that you should be able to do as a part of your job as an authorized inspector. And again, scale this up or down depending on how you have responsibilities divvied up within your jurisdiction. But this gives you a good foundational background for what you could be expected to do or that you might want to understand as a part of your job. The second middle column is under knowledge. And this is identifying both where it's recommended that you have a basic understanding of certain types of information, and then where it may be more beneficial if you have an in-depth knowledge of certain types of information. And so again, you know, these are recommendations, not requirements, but it gives you a good sense of, you know, if there's certain things that you should understand or read or be aware of to give you context for the program and different tools that you might use in your job, that's where I would take a look at that middle column. And then on the right-hand side, what we also tried to do is identify what are the different types of experiences or skills you might want to obtain as an authorized inspector for your kind of daily function. And this is where it says, to prove you can do this, you should have these experiences or skills. And again, these are just options and opportunities for you. It's not like you have to go down the full list and check. But use this as a guide if you're curious about, you know, what's the range of opportunity out there. And then the one thing I'll say is we are working with the county right now on the different types of trainings, and so we're probably going to update those. But for each area of responsibility, we're looking at, you know, what are the, 2 or 3 kind of core trainings that should be held so that there's this opportunity to share information, both, you know, from a presenter to you all, but also between yourselves. Okay, so that's basically what this handout is, and I would say use it, you know, as applicable to your job and how your city functions. Okay, so for today, what are we wanting to achieve with today's training? As you all know, we started off with a pre-survey, and then at the very end, and it's anonymous, there's no stress on it. At the end, we're going to do the same thing and do a post-survey, and what we try to do with that is look at, you know, how effective were we in imparting some of the key messages we're wanting to with today's training, and we'll also use it as a gauge and maybe where questions weren't worded well, or, you know, we'll try to update those over the future, but we try to use that periodically over time, you know, as a way to gauge the effectiveness of the types of trainings that we're doing, and if where we need to make changes, we'll make those changes. So it's very helpful for us and gives us a gauge on that. And it's important because it links back to the objectives for this training. And that is what we really want to do is we want to, through the course of what we're going to walk through today, review the core competencies. We just talked about these, the core competencies, knowledge, and professional experiences or skills. We want to touch on a lot of those aspects, outline and fundamentally outline the techniques that are necessary to conduct defensible investigations. And again, this is scalable, and we'll talk about this more towards the end of the presentation, but also provide an opportunity for you all to talk amongst yourselves. So if somebody asks a question and you feel like you have a good answer for it, I welcome you to answer that and also to share your information. So if somebody's doing one thing one way in their jurisdiction and you do it differently, please speak up and mention that, because I think it's good communication back and forth. Okay, and then as I mentioned throughout today, I have a few places where we'll pause for questions, and then I also have some group questions just to break it up a little bit. They're fairly easy, but we'll just walk through. I have about 8 of those, and so we'll just pause typically after this slide to do a group question together. So any questions so far on the introduction and purpose for today? Okay. All right, so fun group question number 1. So I would read it, and then when you have an answer, you can raise your hand. And otherwise, I'll randomly pick on people. Okay, so who has an answer to number 1? Okay, we're going to pick on this side of the room first. Okay, so we have true as one of the answers. Any other answers? Okay, C. Any B's? So I would say B, and the only reason why I would personally say B is because you aren't, from a regulatory perspective, you're not required to like complete everything that's in this table and obtain all of this, but it is strongly encouraged because it will help you have a broader context for the program when you're talking with people in the public or explaining to a facility kind of why you're doing what you're doing. It just gives you a lot of that good background. So to me, the fundamental word in there is required. You're not necessarily required, but it's encouraged. Okay. Very good. So we'll keep moving. All right, so the next piece, the next thing that I'd like to do, again, this is for context purposes, and so I do recognize for people who have been involved in the stormwater program for some time, this may be somewhat reflective for you, but I want to make sure that when we're all using different terms, that we understand what those terms are and where they're coming from. So we'll do a brief overview of the stormwater program. So when we talk about the stormwater program and stormwater permits, to put into context in the regulatory framework in the state of California, there are 3 types of stormwater permits. There are what are considered industrial-based permits, and that includes industrial and construction sites. And so you may be familiar with the industrial general permit and construction general permit. That's kind of under that industrial side. Construction is actually considered industrial within the regulations, and so that's why they're grouped together. But they are 2 separate permits with very different requirements. There are kind of transportation-based permits, and that's really Caltrans. Sometimes people will refer to Caltrans permit as a municipal permit, but they really have very fundamentally different infrastructure than a city, and so they really are a different animal. And then we have municipal permits, which are often referred to as a phase 1 or phase 2 permit. And that's because literally of the phasing of when the regulations came out. So phase 1 was first focused on cities that were 100,000 population or greater. Phase 2 came out roughly 9 years later, and that's focused on what's considered smaller, medium-sized cities, which are 10,000 to 100,000. There's also another kind of subcategory, which are called non-traditional MS4s, and that's things like prisons, schools, which kids think are prisons, but that's really because they functionally are different. They have a different type of population, that kind of comes in and out during the day. So for our purposes, Orange County has a phase, well, actually 2, but are regulated pursuant to a phase 1 permit. And even though there are smaller cities by population within Orange County, because everything is so kind of intertwined and smaller cities are surrounded by these, larger, more than 100,000 population cities, everything was grouped as a phase 1. So that's why, if you're wondering how come I'm a population of 50,000 and I got lumped in this, that's why. Because in the very early permits, they pushed everyone together. Very similar to LA and San Diego. Okay, so when we talk about phase 1 permits, that's what we're talking about, and that's where you all are at. And then we essentially have 2 phase 1 NPDES permits within Orange County, and I drew a very accurate and precise line there to note the differences between North Orange County and South Orange County. So North Orange County is regulated by the Santa Ana Regional Board, Southern Orange County by the San Diego Regional Board. And again, there are different numbers of permittees and watersheds and such in each. But one thing that I want to point out is that they both have these, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, but both regions have fairly similar permits, but they are different, and we'll just note a couple of those differences today. And then there are different guiding documents that have been developed in each of the regions. So for example, in the Santa Ana region, and we're going to move to this in our next couple of slides, the principal policy and guidance document that identifies how the cities and county are complying with the permit is in the Drainage Area Management Plan, or DAMP, and you can see that in the parens there. In South Orange County, there's a different document, the Water Quality Improvement Program, that's been developed and just recently approved by the San Diego Regional Board. And they're very different documents, but they describe kind of the approach and goals for how the permit will be complied with and how water quality will be protected in each of those regions. So at a very high level, just being aware of those documents, I think is helpful. Okay, and then turning our attention just briefly to the Santa Ana region and then San Diego. In the Santa Ana region, again, and a lot of you may be very familiar with this, but there's the Drainage Area Management Plan, or DAMP. And this, again, basically describes how the cities or how the MS4s comply with the permit and what all the programs include and how they're implemented. And the annual reports for those who are involved in those very much kind of mimic this type of structure. And so when you're porting out information, you'll often see them in these kind of categories like legal authority, municipal activities, et cetera. If you read nothing else, or if you're familiar with nothing else, I would encourage you to be somewhat familiar with the Section 10, which is highlighted in red, because that's very specifically how the MS4s are complying with those requirements in the permit and defines the illegal discharge illicit connection program. And I think even for the South County folks, this still gives that kind of fundamental programmatic structure to the IDIC program. And so I think this is pretty useful to have an understanding of what at least that says, even if it's a skim. Okay? And then as I mentioned, the San Diego region has a water quality improvement plan, or the WQIP, and you can see it's really structured very differently, and that's because there's been this really fundamental shift between the permits, and I expect that we'll see the same thing in the newer Santa Ana permit. But because of that, instead of focusing on like all of these pillars, kind of that make up the stormwater program, it's really shifted to looking at the receiving waters, identifying conditions of concern, or priority conditions, and then backing that out into what do we need to do to be protective of those conditions. And so that's why you see really a fundamental difference between those two documents. But they both have information in them that relate to the IDIC program. So if you're in one or other of the regions, just being familiar with what that says as it relates to IDIC, I think is pretty helpful. Matt, do you guys have anything to add to that, or is that? Okay, and then again, when so we've talked about a little bit about like the permits and what they're requiring, and then how those are interpreted into the plans themselves, and then when we're really talking about, well, what is the IDIC program? When we talk about that, what does that entail? And as defined here on the slide, it's a program framework for effectively prohibiting and responding to the discharge of non-stormwater into the municipal storm drain system. And I would say, in my mind, it consists of kind of both a proactive and reactive side. On the proactive side, and again, this is kind of how I think about the IDIC program, this really kind of goes to detection of illegal discharges and illicit connections. So things like, and I think also general awareness, things like placarding the storm drains, public education, having, and we'll touch on this in a minute, having a monitoring program, the dry weather monitoring programs to help identify chronic discharges and where you might have exceedances in dry weather conditions. I think that's kind of the proactive side. So it's where you're identifying problems or people are coming to you with problems. On the reactive side is when you all get calls about problems that have been found, and then you go out kind of in that authorized inspector role, and you're responding to that spill responding to that incident or complaint that's brought in, and then figuring out how do you rectify it, who's a responsible party, and you conduct whatever investigations needed. So that's kind of so I think, but both portions in my mind comprise the IDIC program. Okay, and then as long as we're kind of continuing to define things, there are a few more terms I just want to make sure we're all on the same page with. So continuing forward, really quickly, I would like to define the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, or MS4. I will probably collectively refer to you all as, MS4s, plural, because oftentimes the cities and counties are kind of referred to as that, and that is a term that's defined straight out of the federal regulations. And I would say it is an East Coast-centric term because we don't really refer to the infrastructure as storm sewer systems. We really refer to them really as storm drains, and that's just because that's kind of an East Coast-centric term that was used at the time. So how it's defined is, and it's here on the slide, a conveyance or system of conveyances, and it really includes, and again, this is, in my mind, it includes curb gutter, the catch basins, drain inlets, and then the underground kind of pipe or daylighted portions of the MS4. But where it stops is when you are discharging into that receiving water. So all of the infrastructure basically that's been built, that's the MS4. And then the receiving water, whether it's a creek, river, coastline, that's where the MS4 definition stops. We argue a little bit with the regional boards about that, but that's how I believe it's intended. Okay, so that's the MS4, and again, seems somewhat basic, but just to make sure when we're talking MS4, it's not just, for example, the daylighted underground pipes from the catch basin. It does include, or can include, the kind of the curb gutter line as well. So on stormwater, again, seems somewhat obvious, but this is a defined term from the federal regulations, and it's defined as days like today. Stormwater runoff, it can also include, for example, in the Tahoe area and where you get snow melt runoff, or other types of surface runoff or drainage related to precipitation events. So on a rainy day, when you have a rain event occurring or just occurred and you have that runoff, that's considered stormwater. And there is a distinction both from a regulatory perspective and management perspective about how you deal with stormwater versus the other portion, which is the other side of the coin, non-stormwater. And that's really more where the authorized inspectors are going to be addressing issues. And this is, flows that do not entirely consist of stormwater. And I don't believe that non-stormwater is officially defined within the federal regulations, but a lot of times within the permits, there's definitions for these terms. So what does non-stormwater consist of? Well, there's kind of some obvious things it consists of, and there's some slides of these above here. But my experience is that it typically derives from somebody who's washing something off. I think that accounts for most of what you might find with non-stormwater. So again, it's a dry day outside and there's water running off of a property or water running down the street. It could be somebody who is washing a car, it could be a mobile detailer, it could be pressure washing, but then you can also have these situations that are shown in the slide, which include, it could be a deliberate dumping of material, or it could be leaks or spills that people may or may not be aware of that are occurring that generate something that's coming off-site into the storm drain. So that's considered non-stormwater, and the requirement is that these need to be effectively prohibited. And that's important because it's hard to control what everyone else is doing out in the environment, but the requirement that the cities effectively prohibit those discharges is what the requirement is, and that's through like your legal ordinances and your detection programs and response programs. That's considered effective prohibition. But I do want to raise one nuance of this, and that is that in the regulations and in the permits, there's a specific list in both permits. They are similar yet different, but there is a list of what I would call kind of conditional exceptions to the non-stormwater prohibition, and that is that what this is attempting to do is recognizing that there are some types of discharges that may occur that really don't pose a harm necessarily, so that they should be allowed to occur. Or if they're permitted under a separate permit and they're meeting those requirements, they should be of high enough quality that they're allowed to occur. The thinking around this has changed over time, and there's differentiation between the Santa Ana region and the San Diego region. Let's just lost my train of thought. But essentially what this says is that these discharges are allowed as long as they meet certain conditions and they are not a source of pollutants to the storm drain or receiving waters. So you can kind of see on the list, there's things like Irrigation water, Santa Ana region only. This is now prohibited in San Diego region, but other things such as uncontaminated pumped groundwater, dechlorinated pool discharges, et cetera. In the Santa Ana permit, this list is really entirely consistent with the Code of Federal Regulations, and they haven't tinkered with it too much. On the San Diego side, there's a lot more, clauses and exceptions and requirements linked to those. So you're allowed, for example, to have dechlorinated pool discharges, air conditioning, condensate, whatever, as long as very specific BMPs are implemented related to those specific discharges. So there are some nuances between them. And I think my purpose of telling you this today is so that you're aware of it. I don't know that you necessarily have to commit this to memory per se, but I think it's more be aware that some types of discharges are allowed. And if you have a question when you're on the field, you can always talk to a colleague or your stormwater program manager and get clarification on if something is or is not allowed. So just be aware that some things are allowed under certain conditions. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is we talk about IDIC a lot, one of the other acronyms that we use. And again, this might be somewhat obvious, but this is defined oftentimes in the permit and also or in the Code of Federal Regulations. And so ID being illegal discharge, IC being illicit connection. So illegal discharge would be, again, those spills or discharges of material that should not be coming into the storm drain. That's an illegal discharge. Illicit connection refers more to that kind of man-made connection that might come into an underground part of the infrastructure, or maybe it's coming across, out of someone's backyard into like a flood control channel. So somebody's trying to drain something off of their property or make some sort of physical connection. The one thing again that I'll just point out is that the term illegal and illicit are used almost interchangeably, and there's no consistency throughout the state or even within regions. So just be aware that illegal or illicit kind of saying the same thing really in the end. So if you see differences, illegal discharge in my mind is the same as illicit discharge, same thing. So you might see those differences from time to time. Okay, any questions? Terminology? Okay. Yeah. I think you can, yeah. It's like stormwater, one word or two. It's the question that will never be fully answered and agreed upon. And it's super basic. Yeah, I think they're completely interchangeable. Yeah. Forever I try to be ultra consistent, and there's so not consistency anymore that I've just kind of given up. Yes. Sorry, I can't fully hear you. The irrigation water? Okay. It is officially in the Santa Ana region. It's officially in that conditionally allowed list. In the San Diego region, it is no longer considered allowed. Yeah, you might have more on that.
Yeah, it's prohibited. Any irrigation runoff in South County has to be stopped.
Oh, I understand. It's the term condition that you're wondering, what are the conditions? Got it. The blanket condition in the Santa Ana region is that they are not a source of pollutants. So that's just a blanket kind of condition that they're allowed with, as long as that's met. They're not a significant source. In the San Diego region, they have made findings that it is a source of pollutants, and therefore they have taken it off the list. Yeah, what's that? It is. Right. It is a different philosophy in how they're going to regulate. That's what it is. It's a policy decision in how they're regulating. Yeah. Yeah.
Part of the prohibition in South County is because it's a conveyance of pollutants. So if you have runoff, it's going to move
Right. But you're right. There's no, the conditions are the same, North County, South County, so why are they being regulated different? And it's a philosophy of the regional board. That's what it comes down to. Yeah. Okay. So I know it's super fun. So fun question number 2, and I'm going to focus on this side of the room for the answer this time. So as an authorized inspector, you are required to, I would say, assist in effectively prohibiting what to the MS4? Yeah, C, right. Yeah, these are, not too difficult, but yes, C. So basically, you're focused on all non-stormwater discharges except those that are conditionally exempt. And again, if you have questions about which ones are exempt, if you're not entirely sure, I would just talk to your stormwater program manager. Things do change over time, and so if something has changed you're not aware of or sensitivities have arisen with the regional boards, you can work with them to figure out what those are. The whole goal is not to get sideways with the regional board, so anytime you can prevent that, it's good. Okay, so the next thing we're going to go through is a little bit of information. Again, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the regulatory framework, but more specifically as to how it relates to the different cities and specifically to the IDIC program. So we'll talk about the water quality ordinance and related guidance. So over time, the program has evolved and regulatory requirements have changed, and so there are different guidance documents that have been developed. And again, it's just so that you all can use them as tools, as applicable, and the general guidelines have been established so that the procedures are outlined, as clear as possible, which helps with consistency among different cities and within regions. And also importantly to make sure that whatever information is obtained during any type of source identification that you might be going through or investigation, that it's legally defensible. And we'll talk about that a little bit further. But you want to make sure that that data and information is defensible and helps make the case you're wanting to make, even if it's the simplest type of enforcement actions all the way up to an actual criminal case. You want that same level of defensibility. Okay, so the framework that we're going to walk through, the framework and tools that we're going to briefly touch on are shown in this particular slide. And so we're going to talk a little, ever so briefly about the municipal stormwater permit and the program requirements that are in that permit. And then again, what the MS4s have done in the development of the DAMP and the WQIP or the corresponding city-based local implementation plans or JERMPs is they've then translated those requirements into here's how we're implementing that program within our jurisdiction. So it kind of is a way to take those permit requirements and identify how those are being responded to and what the program consists of, how it's being implemented. Some of the related information that's been developed as a part of that program includes the Model Water Quality Ordinance and ordinances that you all then adopted based on that. And then other tools such as the Enforcement Consistency Guide, which is still being used in the Santa Ana region, the Enforcement Response Plan, which may really become countywide at some point, and investigative guidance and other types of guidance materials. So we're just going to touch on those briefly. Okay, so as I mentioned, the stormwater permit, in addition to a host of a whole range of requirements, has very specific requirements related to illegal discharge, illicit connections. And it talks about the fact that the MS4s need to, as stated on the slide, effectively prohibit the discharge of pollutants to the storm drain system. And again, that's done through a number of different mechanisms. Again, things like public education, stenciling or placards, having the hotline, responding to the hotline, all those types of requirements kind of go along with that effective prohibition. Establishing the legal authority so that you all can go out and do your jobs is a part of that prohibition, and it's specific to the water quality ordinance. And then the other component of this is that over time and through the annual reports, it has requirements that you then have to demonstrate how that program is effective. And so I'm not sure to what extent some of you may be involved in that process, but there are very specific different metrics and ways that that's reported out on to demonstrate to the regional board that you have an effective program. Okay. And then, so then, as we mentioned earlier, we have these two documents that have been developed, and they're updated over time as the regulatory requirements change. And in particular, again, the Santa Ana region has that Section 10 which is again the drainage area management plan really lays out again those core components of the stormwater program and what it consists of. And that section 10, even if you're in the San Diego region, I think is good to have that understanding of what the program consists of. And again, remember that the Water Quality Improvement Plan has some of those elements, but has just been developed slightly differently for different purposes. But it still will have some pieces of illicit discharge or illegal discharge, illicit connection program in it. So being aware of what your governing document says, I think is helpful so that if you're having conversations about what you're doing to implement that program, you have a little bit of background. Okay, and as I mentioned, the stormwater permit explicitly requires that adequate legal authority is established by each of the cities. This is an original permit requirement. So the model water quality ordinance was initially developed actually in 1993. And you all have water quality ordinances. I'm sure you're well aware of those. But just quick background, that was developed, the model was developed in 1993. It was pretty much, I think, by 1997, widely adopted by all of the cities. And then there was a recent update in 2009 to that ordinance for the San Diego region to address that irrigation runoff prohibition specifically. And I will tell you that the thing that impresses me about this model water quality ordinance is that it was pretty insightful, I think, for its day. It has withstood numerous different permit iterations and requirements, and I think it's personally kind of impressive that it's really pretty solid ordinance. And so I think you all have pretty much almost the same ordinance, maybe slightly different variations, but very similar ordinances. So kudos to Woodliff, Spradlin, and Smart, or whoever did that. They did a good job. Okay, so then there's the model water quality ordinance, which is good because it identifies what authorities you all have, and you know what the different roles and responsibilities are. As I mentioned, you know, we touched on the definition. It defines, you know, what an authorized inspector is, for example. But then there was recognition that well, the ordinance is fine, but when you're talking to somebody who's going out and actually implementing the stormwater program and conducting investigations, there wasn't really that corresponding document to help guide some of that decision making and education about what that program is about. And so the Enforcement Consistency Guide was initially developed in 1997, and then again, it was you know, incorporated or adopted in whole or in part by the different cities as a way to give that type of programmatic information, on the ground implementation information to the authorized inspectors. That document in the San Diego region has kind of morphed into this enforcement response plan, which again may ultimately become the Enforcement Consistency Guide in North Orange County as well. And my kind of quick scan of that is that, and this is the way that a lot of the legal authority expectations are going now, is that what it does is it describes in a little bit more detail what are the methodologies and tools and enforcement options that are available when you're dealing with like a construction site versus residential area versus commercial industrial. So it gives a little bit more definition to the different ways that you might use those tools, which I don't really think the Enforcement Consistency Guide did so much. It just kind of gave you what the tools were. Would you agree there are differences between them?
That and also the enforcement response plan requires or steps up enforcement. You have to have
The progressive enforcement, right. Right, so the Enforcement Consistency Guide doesn't touch on that so much. Yeah.
The newer permits require
They do.
the ERP to have more of a plan to implement the
Yeah, no, you're right. Since the water quality, or the Enforcement Consistency Guide was developed, you're right. Kind of that concept of progressive enforcement, escalating enforcement really did ramp up in the permits. And the development of an enforcement response plan, although Orange County did that proactively when it wasn't required, that terminology now pops up in a lot of permits, and so there's a very explicit requirement now to develop that. I'm telling you, you guys were ahead of the curve. It's pretty impressive. Okay, so then the other types, so that kind of gives you the framework for how enforcement can be conducted. And then there was also a desire to have additional guidance regarding what would you do, what do you do during an investigation? What are the different tools you can use? And so there was some investigative guidance that was developed. This example was developed for the San Diego region initially when the numeric action levels, first came on the scene. And it provides some basic guidance for how, what kind of information might you want? How can you interpret that information? I think that there's a sense that even though the requirement for the numeric action levels in San Diego region has changed, this still is at least useful document for both North and South Orange County. So it's still out there as a guidance document if it's useful to folks. And again, in the San Diego region, I just mentioned this, when the numeric action levels were first incorporated into the permit, they had a different function, and it's now changed a little bit, but they're still very useful. Ooh, battery's running low. Do we have a plug? Darn HPs. Well, I'll continue. Oh, there's the bag. Do we see where the bag is? There was a bag. Okay, you're going to help out. Okay, I'm going to keep talking while we look for a plug so we don't lose our battery here. So the numeric action levels now are really used as a way to provide context for the information that you might get back. So it kind of helps identify progress that might be made, and if we're achieving kind of that effective prohibition and achieving some of the strategies outlined in the WQIP. Oh, there's the bag. Okay, we'll pause for just a second while we plug in. You guys are good. I heard distress and you were right on it. Perfect time to pause. Okay, so why we're doing this, are there any questions about kind of that overarching framework? Is it right here?
It's a good question. No.
Oh, no, it's not. Okay.
I think it's...
There it is. Any questions so far? No? Guys are good? Ooh, so we can go to this. Fun group question number 3. We'll go back to the left-hand side of the room. So you can take a look at the top screen. Answer is yes, all the above. And again, this is something that I really do want you to take away, is that there's a lot of information that's available to you if you're looking for or want additional information. And if you're not aware of where to find it, I would say you can reach out to James, Duke, Matt. They're all very aware of where information is if you can't easily find it.
It's okay to unplug it quick so I can use both.
Oh, I don't think we have anything plugged in. Yeah.
No, we don't.
Say go for it.
I don't know what that is.
We'll find out.
Didn't lose connection. Should be good.
I was wondering why it dimmed. That's why it dimmed. Thank you guys so much.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that.
It's not a problem. If we're anything, it's flexible, so it's all good. Okay, yes, all the above, so you have a lot of tools that are available to you if you need them. Okay, and then the next piece that we're going to go into is detection. And again, and we are right on time. This is perfect. So what we want to talk a little bit about, again, kind of thinking about this program from cradle to grave, if you will. Now we're at the cradle. How are IDIC incidents detected? And really the bottom line is through a whole range of different mechanisms. And again, you're probably experienced most of these. One is, and we'll talk briefly about the monitoring programs. There are monitoring programs in both Santa Ana region and San Diego region, which are explicitly conducted to help find chronic types of discharges. But there's also the public can help identify problems that they find, and that's why you all have the hotlines and response networks. You might get them through either calls or online reports, depending on the mechanisms that you have set up in your cities. And really, I think in addition to the public, one of the other really good mechanisms, it's really important not to overlook, are your own staff. So as folks are out in the field conducting their activities, they see everything going on in the city. It's fantastic. So where there's certain issues that are popping up, they have the ability to reach out very quickly and oftentimes just immediately right to the person who needs to get the information. So they are an incredibly good resource to use to identify these issues. And I don't, when I was involved in the program, there was something like, on average, about 400, I think, countywide issues that would get reported. Do you guys know what the numbers are? Is that similar? Or? Yeah, annually. Like number of calls that might come in. I'm quizzing you. You can make up a number. I won't even know. Yeah, so several hundred. Or sorry. Yeah, okay. So for Orange County jurisdiction, 150 to 200. Yeah, so I mean, but the thing is that's a decent number, but to me that shows a healthy reporting network, because I really truly, I'm going to say this several times, the program that you guys have in place for the IDIC program is more robust and put together than any other program that I've come across so far in the state, and I think it's done really well, and like your reporting network is good, the connection with the DA is fantastic, and I just haven't seen that type of program replicated elsewhere. Again, I'm not an expert on all the different programs in the state, but a few of them. So I just, to me, that shows a very healthy program, because there are things that happen. They just do. No matter how much education you do, no matter how much you reach out, you're going to have problems crop up. So you guys do a good job at finding them and responding to them and following up with them. Okay, so one of the things that we mentioned are monitoring programs. So both in the Santa Ana region and San Diego region, there are specific programs, as I mentioned, that are in place. They're modified over time and morphed based on information that's learned and ways to do them more effectively. But essentially, both of these programs help to identify and then ultimately eliminate these types of discharges to the storm drain system. And again, they're set up in slightly different ways, but that is their function, and that is a core aspect of the program when it was first designed or envisioned by Congress. And so this is really kind of a legacy part of the program that continues forward. Okay, so then I want to talk a little bit about the differences between what we're going to categorize as kind of large incidents and then small incidents. And we'll talk a little bit about what those differences are in who responds and maybe how you report that out. But that'll continue forward when we start talking about how you collect different types of information, such as informal interviews, photographs, samples, et cetera. So a lot of what we talk about after this, you're really going to scale up or down depending on the type of incident you might come across and also your role in that incident. So the first types are the big ones. And these are oftentimes you've got fire involved, multiple agencies. You might have multiple jurisdictions because you have an incident that occurs, but then later on, something's going to flow downstream into another jurisdiction, so you need to pull them in. And you might just have different. You might have somebody from healthcare who's also wanting to be involved in addition to yourselves and your public works folks. So these are the real big incidents. They are less common, which is a good thing. And I also recognize that with the exception of a small portion of the cities, most of the time these may be deferred to county staff through the Water Quality Ordinance Implementation Agreement, which we'll talk about shortly. So you may not come across these very often, or you might not be involved in them at all. But I think for purposes of context and the overall program, just understanding how you kind of scale up or down based on the type of incident is helpful. So there's the large incidents, which are less common. And then you have the smaller incidents, which again, this is what you're going to get more of. You know, somebody calling up and saying there's something white in my curb and gutter, neighbors tattling on neighbors about various issues, which does happen. Or you might, just see something that's occurring or have, this is more the type of incident that's going to be reported through your public hotline and probably with like your public works staff or other field staff. So this is really what you're going to be dealing with more. And I touched briefly on the, so there's two ways that the program can be implemented in Orange County. The first is that the city on the left-hand side, the city really has primary responsibility for the program and really utilizing their staff and resources and private contracts as needed to field the calls when they come in, go out in the field and respond to them, do any cleanup that's necessary, and follow up with enforcement. Or on the other side, there can actually be, the cities can enter into an agreement with the county, which is called the Water Quality Ordinance Implementation Agreement. And what that does is that gives the city the ability to use county staff and resources to help in whole or in part portions of the program. So so taking a call once it's come in and responding and cleaning up and with the exception of enforcement. So there can be a lot of activities all the way up to the issuance of the enforcement action. There can be support for the enforcement, such as photographs and samples and such that are taken, but the actual enforcement needs to come from the city, correct? Okay. So there's really these two mechanisms. My understanding is that the three cities who are really kind of fully doing this themselves are Anaheim, Newport Beach, and Huntington Beach. And everyone else is more on the side of utilizing county staff as needed to assist with those resources. Correct. Okay.
Key is assist. You can't do
Yeah.
routine stuff. You'll assist larger incidents.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. Anything more on that?
You can also do sampling or anything. Basically, the agreement allows for small cities that don't have resources to be able to tap into the county's resources for any technical or any pollution response, any investigations that the cities don't have resources or technical ability to address.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. And so touching on what Duke said, the next couple of slides will outline that. So I mentioned there are 31 cities who participate in this agreement in some manner. And again, the types of assistance that the cities can receive through this agreement include the response, after-hours coverage, and enforcement support. I should put the word support on that. And the after-hours coverage is important, right? Because the spills that are the incidents that are the worst are going to come at Friday at 6 p.m., right? Or on the weekends or on a holiday. So having that ability to reach out to somebody who's available is incredibly helpful. Because that has a lot of labor impacts and cost impacts and whatnot to the cities. Okay? And what types of resources? Duke just touched on these. But the county actually has, in addition to staff that have been pretty widely trained over the years, there's a lot of additional resources such as access to the necessary labs. So whether you have a bacteria sample or metals or some sort of other type of volatile material, there's access to the range of labs that might be qualified to conduct those analyses. There's field monitoring resources. There's a whole host of vehicles that, again, depending on the water body and the type of incident, that you can reach out or that can be used. And then also, we'll touch on this a little bit more with water quality sampling, but there's a whole range of equipment that can be used for sampling. And also in working with the district attorney, there's also, as James was mentioning earlier this morning, there's also the ability to bring in other types of tools as needed depending on the incident, or yes, depending on the incident. And also, again, then the secured evidence refrigerator and different types of record keeping and invoicing tools. So I think the bottom line, the message is that there's a lot of tools that are available through that implementation agreement that you then don't need to worry about trying to staff up and deal with internally. So that's good. Good leveraging of resources. Okay. Any questions on that portion, on the detection portion? Okay, fun group question number 4. Which of the following is the false statement? And I'm going to look to this side of the room to help answer this one. Okay, so we have an answer of C. Would you say B? D as in dog? The others D as well? So I would say D, and the main reason why, but this is why it's good. It's good to have the conversation. The reason why is has to do with the enforcement. Oh, wait a minute. Hang on a second. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I completely misread that one. Right. None of them are false. Right. So they're all true. Right. Thank you. It's a problem when I read too quickly. Yes, so they are all true statements. Question number 4. Okay, so I think we're going to go through this next section, and then we'll take a little bit of a break. It's a good time to break, actually. So response framework. So I want to talk a little bit about when we're talking about what are the responsibilities and what are the different ways that a response might occur. And again, this is scaling between the large and small types of incidents. So in general, just kind of recapping, the types of responsibilities that are typical for an authorized inspector, and again, you might use some of these through the county or not, but in general, each municipality needs to have folks who are available 7 days a week, 24 hours a day to respond to incidents as they're reported. Need to have an understanding about how you conduct an investigation and how to collect legally defensible information. Having an understanding about who needs to be involved when, who do you need to notify, when do you notify them, what is their area of jurisdiction, and how this information is reported is important. And again, kind of that sampling and documentation, again, to support any sort of future enforcement. Understanding, what does cleanup entail? How do you deal with the disposal? And then understanding the range of enforcement actions and using best professional judgment in how you apply those enforcement actions. And we'll go through some more of these in detail, but that's the general responsibilities as an authorized inspector who's helping implement the IDIC program, which is a part of the Stormwater Program. Okay, so again, thinking large versus small incidents. Typically, larger incidents will involve more agencies. So you might have police, fire, city, county, Caltrans, might be typical folks who you see. Depending on how large the incident is, the incident command system may be used. That is rarer. That is really for very large incidents. But I'll just show you ever so briefly how you all would fit into that as an authorized inspector. In fact, how many people have had an incident you've responded to where there was an incident command structure like officially invoked with you guys? How many times?
About
10. Yeah, over the course of your career, right? Yeah. I think I remember maybe 3. Yeah. So it's not all that often. I mean, maybe once every 2 or 3 years, there's something that's large enough that warrants that. There is very specific training related to incident command system, oftentimes through like oil spill types of OSPR, or they may conduct that type of training if you're interested. Oh, NIMS. Oh, got it, yes, yeah. So again, if you, to the extent that you're interested or that it applies, you can go through that particular type of training. Small incidents, which is really what we're more talking about for today, it's really going to typically be, you get some information, you respond to it, it's kind of you might have your public works folks come out, maybe you reach out to the county, maybe you reach out to Caltrans, but it's really going to be much smaller and contained. But irregardless of whether you're dealing with a large or small incident, I think, and we'll touch on this again in a little bit, really the critical priorities are first and foremost your personal safety as you go out onto the site, and then, for example, when there's a fire or there's something that's going on, human health and safety is going to play kind of that #1 role. There's always going to be concern about the environment. So if there's a huge structure fire that you're responding to, fire's #1 concern is going to be to put that out and to make sure that people are safe and out of the building, et cetera. When they can turn their attention, even if the fire is still active, to the runoff and the protection of the environment and helping with, diking or berming areas or whatnot, they will do that. But it really is in these priorities, in this order. And then we talked just briefly, again, there are very specific trainings that we just mentioned regarding incident command. So see, these are the very infrequent, very large types of incidents that will occur, and just in really general terms. So you will have somebody or some agency who's functioning as an incident commander. So there will be a person who's designated. It could be from fire, or it could be a state or federal agency who steps in and takes on that role. And then they will have very specific people who they deal with. So they'll have somebody who's dealing with public information. If there's reporters or whatnot, they will handle that. And really, you are not to talk to any of those folks. They'll have somebody who's conducting general safety for the scene to make sure that nobody is exposed. Again, that's that critical priority. And then they'll have somebody else who's helping be a liaison with other agencies or other folks as needed. But then really the way that I see this is kind of under that general staff grouping. That's where an authorized inspector, and again, whether it's city or county, may be there kind of conveying as needed what the needs are to protect the water resources. So what the concerns are, what the needs are, what resources are needed, and then also helping direct what's desired to be protective of the storm drain infrastructure or water body. So that's what the information that is fed into that structure. And who might be involved in this type of structure? It really depends. This is a very general type of chart. It depends on where the incident occurred, what materials are involved, flow paths, if there's multimedia involved. So it really does depend. But in general, you're going to see the state and federal folks more involved on kind of the larger side, and then the folks who you kind of work with in much more frequency, such as sewer, public works, health, police, fire, public works. I have that twice. But they're going to be involved more on the smaller side, also possibly on the larger side. And again, the regional board, may pop their head up from time to time on what would be considered more of a smaller incident. And that just depends on, did they get the notification first? Are they tracking it? Are they interested? So there may be a little bit of communication that happens there, again, depending on their level of interest and if it's political or, if there's some other driver. Okay, and then I believe this is out of, is it the county's local implementation plan, section 10. This is a pretty helpful chart. So if you're interested, I'm sure you can just take a peek at that document. But what this does is we're not going to walk through it in detail, but it provides kind of a flow path or framework for, who you might contact, when you might contact them. So again, if you don't have some sort of structure or if-then type of framework you're working through, this is a good one that you can use as a basis for helping make some of those decisions in the field. And then also, there's not necessarily a formal, notification chart per se, but for the purposes of today, I worked with Matt and Duke and James and others, just to kind of put together a real rough, here's some key notifications that you could think of if you're out in the field. So, for example, you might need to contact Department of Fish and Wildlife if you have something that's impacting creeks, streams, or rivers that they might be involved, that they might be interested in, especially if there's an impact to I guess they're fish and game now. Oh no, they are fish and wildlife. Yeah, they were fish and game. But especially if there's an impact to fish or wildlife or turtles or ducks or whatever, they might be concerned about that. Caltrans is obvious. If it's their jurisdiction, you'll want to reach out to them. Same with the county, if there's flood control channels that are involved, healthcare agency, human health, et cetera. So this is another, again, guide that you can use as needed. I'm sure this could be refined even further, but just understanding who you need to contact when is helpful, especially if you're new to being an authorized inspector. I know when I was first new, I was terrified of that beeper going off. It's like, what do I do? Who do I call? What do I? So it's a lot to take on when you're first starting. That's the day of the beepers. Pagers. Okay, notifications and requests. Two things that I wanted to mention here is that notifications, so again, we just talked about the fact that just understanding, jurisdiction and who to contact when, and having that kind of framework. But also, if you need assistance, you might be out, and if you identify a need, you may want to reach out and ask others, to help you with a particular response or cleanup. There was one incident that I was involved with that there was a slight impact with like fish and wildlife, so it was useful to have them out there. I noticed when they left, the level of attention that we were getting from the responsible party greatly diminished, and we were being very discounted, and so all we did was call them back up and say, it would be really helpful if you could come out because you have a gun and a badge, and so you carry a little bit more authority, and they came out and we got much better cooperation from the responsible party. So they were interested, but they were willing to also come out and help in this particular case because they had already been on scene. So just understanding what additional help you can get sometimes is very useful. And again, when you make a certain notification, there are different types. I think reporting we're going to get into in a little bit. But when you're making a notification, there's basic types of information that will be requested. If you're calling, for example, Office of Emergency Services, or you're filling out a form, there'll be certain fields that they're going to want to know certain types of information, and that's listed here on the slide. What's the other thing I was going to say? Is that when what you know during one point or initially at an incident may change over time. So it's also important that you go back and update that type of notification or reporting so that information evolves with what you learn, a day or two down the road. Even though the initial notification might be kind of your best judgment or guess on what's going on. Classic for that is like a sewer spill. Like you may not have a full understanding if you're working with the sanitation agency what the magnitude of the spill is, but a few days down the road you may have a better sense of that. All right? Questions? Yeah, Duke. Yes, please.
There are requirements within the permit.
Yes.
Notify the regional board of certain incidents.
Yes.
Basically, sewer overflows that are over 1,000 gallons need to be notified to the OES, Cal OES, Office of Emergency Services, and then any incidents that are deleterious to health and wildlife has to be notified to the regional board.
No, really good point. I meant to mention that, and I overlooked it, so thank you. Yes, the permits have very specific requirements, as Duke mentioned, and I think that there's, is there a 24-hour and then 5-day follow-up notification?
That's still in the
Santa Ana permit. Okay, got it. So again, understanding what the notification, like the specific regulatory requirements are for notification is very helpful. Yeah, good point. Okay, one more fun group question, and then we'll take a quick break and then come back. So I think, left-hand side. Question number 5. For smaller incidents, which one? E? Agreement? Everyone's like, yeah, let's just go on break. It's E. Yes, it's E. So for smaller incidents, you may not need an incident command structure. Very true. But you may still be coordinating with other folks even though there's not this formal structure. And the reason why C is not true is because even though you might not need to make notifications, there are other times where you will. So it's not a flat out thing whether you make notifications or not if it's small or large. Okay, with that, let's do a 10-minute break, but like we'll start right back at, let's say, 2:40. Okay.